What happens when one of television's most outspoken hosts goes head-to-head with one of Hollywood's most respected actors, and the conversation spirals so far out of control that it ends with an empty chair and a stunned studio audience? Before we break down exactly what happened, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you stand. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. The episode began like any other. The cameras were rolling, the audience settled in, and Bryan Cranston walked onto the stage to promote his latest project. The applause was warm and genuine as he took his seat, flashing that familiar smile, the same one that once made him America's lovable dad on Malcolm in the Middle, before transforming him into the terrifying Walter White. Joy Behar sat in her usual spot, calm but alert, and from the very start, there was a subtle tension in the air. Bryan. "Welcome back," Joy said with a grin, leaning forward. "It's always a pleasure to have you here." Cranston thanked her and settled into the conversation easily. Joy transitioned smoothly to his new film, noting that he played a journalist uncovering government corruption, a role that felt especially timely. She asked whether he felt a sense of responsibility taking on such a character in today's climate. Cranston responded thoughtfully, saying that storytelling has always existed to hold up a mirror to society. His character, he explained, asks difficult questions and challenges authority, which is exactly what journalism is supposed to do. Joy repeated the phrase challenging authority, but with a noticeable edge. She pointed out that there's a fine line between questioning power and spreading misinformation. The room grew quieter. Cranston paused, choosing his words carefully. He explained that this was precisely why good journalism matters. It should be about seeking truth rather than simply reinforcing existing beliefs. Joy waved the point aside, arguing that many people misuse the idea of asking questions as cover for conspiracy theories and nonsense. Cranston didn't disagree, but he pushed back gently, saying that shutting down legitimate questions simply because they make people uncomfortable is also dangerous. Joy leaned back, crossing her arms, and said this wasn't about discomfort, it was about harm. She cited vaccines, elections, and science as examples of what happens when skepticism goes too far. Still calm, but firmer now, Cranston clarified that he wasn't denying science. He was talking about healthy skepticism toward institutions that haven't always been transparent or truthful with the public. Joy scoffed at the phrase, saying it was a polite way of excusing people who think they're smarter than experts while getting their information from social media. Cranston fired back, saying what he sees instead are institutions that have lost public trust by getting things wrong, lying or covering up facts that are documented, not imagined. The tension in the studio intensified. One of the other hosts attempted to redirect the conversation back to the film, but Joy cut her off, insisting she wanted to hear this. She told Cranston that because he's smart, educated, and influential, his words carry weight, and that when he talks this way, it lends credibility to people who don't deserve it. Cranston's jaw tightened as he asked what exactly she meant by talking this way. He reiterated that people have the right to ask questions. Joy shot back that not all questions are innocent. Some are dog whistles phrased to sound reasonable while quietly spreading doubt about established truths. Cranston leaned forward and asked who decides what those truths are, the media, the government, or those in power, reminding everyone that none of them have perfect histories. Joy threw her hands up, accusing him of implying the media was the enemy. Cranston raised his voice slightly, clarifying that while he never called the media the enemy, it has undeniably gotten major stories wrong. And when that happens, he argued, you can't simply dismiss public skepticism as stupidity or gullibility. Joy pointed directly at him and said what she could blame people for was refusing to accept facts when they're clearly presented. Climate change is real. Vaccines work. The Earth is round. These aren't opinions, she emphasized, they're facts. Asterisk, and by that moment, the studio knew this wasn't just another interview anymore. Asterisk, I haven't disputed any of those things, Cranston said firmly, trying to keep the conversation grounded. That only seemed to frustrate Joy further. She accused him of creating space for those who do deny reality, arguing that all this talk about questioning authority and distrusting institutions feeds the same mindset that sends people spiraling into dangerous rabbit holes. Cranston's voice sharpened as he pushed back, saying that he wasn't encouraging denial, but critical thinking. There is, he emphasized, a real difference between healthy skepticism and outright rejection of reality. From where she was sitting, Joy countered. That difference looked like a very slippery slope. Asterisk, the studio fell completely silent. The audience didn't dare react, and the other hosts looked like they desperately wanted to disappear. This was clearly no longer a casual discussion. Cranston shook his head slowly before speaking again. He told Joy that this was exactly the problem. She was so convinced of her own certainty that she couldn't even entertain the possibility that someone might raise a valid concern without being labeled an extremist. Joy fired back immediately, saying she entertains valid points all the time. What she refuses to entertain, she said, is false equivalency. Not all opinions are equal. Some are rooted in evidence and facts, while others are built on paranoia and feelings. Asterisk, and who decides which is which? Cranston pressed. That, he said, was the question she kept avoiding. She wanted people to trust experts and institutions without hesitation. But when those same institutions have misled the public before, why should they be granted blind faith? Joy leaned forward, her voice rising as she answered. Because the alternative, she said, is chaos, everyone believing whatever they want. Facts be damned. It's people taking horse dewormer instead of real medicine because someone online told them to. Asterisk, Cranston's face flushed as he shot back that it was a straw man argument. He wasn't advocating ignoring medical advice. He was saying that when authorities lose credibility, they have to earn it back. Trust isn't automatic. Joy snapped that credibility is lost precisely because influential voices cast doubt on experts. Cranston pointed at the table and responded sharply that institutions lose credibility because they lie, or at the very least, contradict themselves, change narratives without explanation, and cover up mistakes instead of owning them. That wasn't his doing, he said. That was theirs. Asterisk, one of the other hosts, clearly desperate to steer things away from disaster, tried again to bring the conversation back to the film, noting how Cranston's character grapples with these same questions. But Joy wasn't ready to move on. She demanded specifics. What mistakes exactly was he talking about? Because from her perspective, she was hearing vague accusations without concrete proof. Asterisk, Cranston let out a frustrated laugh. Was she serious? Did she really want him to list every time a government agency or major media outlet got something wrong? They could be there all day. Joy challenged him to name just one. One specific example of this supposed grand conspiracy. Cranston tightened his jaw and corrected her. He never used the word conspiracy. But if she wanted an example, he gave one. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. A war sold to the public on false intelligence, repeated as fact by major media with little scrutiny. Thousands of people died, he reminded her. That wasn't ancient history. Asterisk, Joy waved it away, dismissing it as something from 20 years ago. That didn't count anymore. Cranston stared at her in disbelief, asking if people were just expected to forget that it happened and trust everything they're told now. Joy said people need to move forward. Yes, mistakes were made, but that doesn't mean throwing out expertise or reliable information altogether. Cranston insisted he wasn't doing that. He was calling for accountability, transparency, and honesty for institutions to admit when they're wrong instead of doubling down or deflecting blame. Asterisk. Joy folded her arms again and warned that while everyone is busy being skeptical, misinformation spreads. People die because they don't trust vaccines. Democracies weaken because people don't trust elections. Cranston replied quietly, but firmly, that people don't trust elections because they've noticed irregularities and were immediately told they were crazy for even asking about them. An audible intake of breath rippled through the audience. Asterisk. Joy put a hand to her forehead, incredulous. Was he seriously going there? Cranston said he was pointing out that dismissing concerns and resorting to insults only makes things worse. It pushes people further away. Joy responded flatly that those concerns were based on lies. There was no widespread fraud. Every court case failed. Every audit confirmed the same results. At some point, she said, reality has to be accepted. Asterisk. And at some point. Cranston shot back. People need to ask why so many don't believe it. Was it because millions of people were stupid, or because the institutions demanding trust had broken it over and over again? Before anyone could respond, Joy suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly across the floor. The other hosts froze. The cameras kept rolling. She declared she'd had enough of the conversation. Enough of the both sides argument, her voice shaking just enough to betray how heated things had become. Joy snapped that she was done pretending facts and fiction deserve equal time. Done coddling people who refuse to accept basic reality. Cranston rose from his chair as well, his voice controlled but intense. Saying he wasn't asking her to coddle anyone, he was asking her to understand why trust has collapsed in the first place. And the reason she couldn't, he added, was because acknowledging that breakdown would mean admitting that the institutions she so fiercely defended weren't perfect. Asterisk. Nothing is perfect. Hush. Joy fired back. But science works. Democracy works. Journalism works. Even when mistakes are made, she argued. The system corrects itself. That's how it's supposed to function. Cranston tilted his head and asked whether the system really corrects itself, or whether it simply protects itself. From where he stood, he said, he saw far more circling of wagons than genuine accountability. Asterisk. Joy stepped back from the table, visibly overwhelmed. She said she couldn't do this. She truly couldn't do it anymore. The other hosts quickly stood as well, one of them softly urging everyone to take a breath. But Joy shook her head and locked eyes with Cranston. She accused him of coming onto the show with charm and a smile, only to spout rhetoric that gives cover to conspiracy theorists and extremists while pretending it's just innocent curiosity. Asterisk. They are innocent questions. Cranston shot back, his voice rising to meet hers. When he asked, did questioning become controversial? When did skepticism become dangerous? Joy answered immediately when it stops being about finding truth and starts being about reinforcing bias. Cranston stepped closer to the table, his hands spread, asking who gets to decide what's bias and what's a legitimate concern. She kept returning, he said, to the idea that some neutral authority determines truth. Yet she couldn't name one that had never been compromised or wrong. Asterisk. So what's your solution? Joy demanded. Everyone just believes whatever feels right. No standards, no expertise, just vibes. Cranston answered without hesitation. His solution was transparency, admitting mistakes instead of hiding them, having conversations instead of shutting people down, treating people like adults capable of handling complexity instead of children who need to be told what to think. Asterisk. Joy let out a bitter laugh and asked if he had seen the internet. If he'd seen what happens when people are left to their own devices. They eat Tide Pods, inject bleach, and storm government buildings. Cranston shook his head, calling it a profoundly cynical view of humanity. Yes, some people do stupid things, he said. But most are simply trying to figure out what's true in a world where they've been lied to repeatedly. And instead of helping rebuild trust, instead of guiding them, voices like hers lecture them and call them names. Asterisk people like me. Joy repeated sharply, people who care about facts, about democracy, about public health. People like you, Cranston replied quietly, care more about being right than about understanding why people disagree with you. The room froze. The line landed harder than any raised voice. The audience didn't move. The other hosts looked stunned. Asterisk's Joy stared at him, her mouth slightly open, then laughed again, this time sounding defeated. When she spoke, her voice dropped to an unsettling calm. She said she'd done this show for years, had sat across from people she deeply disagreed with. People who said things she found reprehensible. She debated them, argued with them, tried to find common ground. One of the hosts tried to interrupt, but Joy raised her hand. Asterisk this, she said. Gesturing between herself and Cranston wasn't a debate. This was him telling her nothing could be trusted, that every institution was corrupt, and every expert was lying, and then acting like she was unreasonable for pushing back. Cranston responded, clearly strained, that he never said any of that. He said institutions make mistakes, lose trust, and that trust has to be rebuilt. If she couldn't hear the difference, he said softly, that wasn't his responsibility. Asterisk Joy gathered her notes, straightened them against the table, and turned directly to the camera. She said she needed to speak to the audience at home. She'd always tried to be honest on this show about her opinions, her beliefs, and how she sees the world. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances as the control room likely panicked. Joy continued, saying she could no longer sit there and have this conversation. She could no longer pretend both sides carried equal weight or give airtime to ideas she believed were actively harmful, no matter how politely they were framed as skepticism. Asterisk, she turned back to Cranston and acknowledged his talent, saying she'd enjoyed his work. But what he was doing, whether he realized it or not, was dangerous, and she refused to be part of it. Cranston looked genuinely stunned. He told her he wasn't trying to be dangerous. He was trying to have an honest conversation about why so many people have lost faith in the institutions that once guided them. Asterisk, that's all, Cranston said quietly. Joy shook her head and responded that the way he was framing the issue gave ammunition to people who don't want to reform institutions or improve them, but tear them down entirely. She said she had seen where that path leads. Cranston replied that he had seen it too, and that it leads to authoritarianism. It happens, he argued, when people are told they can't question authority, can't think for themselves, and must simply trust what they're told without challenge. Asterisk Joy closed her eyes for a moment and took a long breath, as if steadying herself. When she opened them again, her tone was calmer but firm. She said they were going to have to agree to disagree. Cranston nodded and said that was fine, because that had been his point from the very beginning, that disagreement should be possible, without one person being labeled dangerous or irresponsible. Asterisk. Joy gave a small smile, but it never reached her eyes. The problem, she said, was that some disagreements carry real consequences, and she wasn't willing to pretend otherwise, just to keep things comfortable. She placed her notes down on the table with a finality that echoed through the studio. One of the other hosts reached toward her, suggesting they take a break, but Joy cut her off. She looked at her fellow hosts, then at Cranston, and finally into the camera. Asterisk, she said she was done, not just with the conversation, but with the show itself. Asterisk, a collective gasp swept through the audience. Cranston's eyes widened as he stood there in disbelief. He told her this wasn't necessary. Joy answered simply that it was necessary for her. as she began unhooking her microphone. She said she had given years to the show and loved it deeply, but she couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep having conversations that went nowhere and gave platforms to ideas she fundamentally believed were harmful. She said she just couldn't do it anymore. The other hosts started talking over each other, pleading with her to stop, to go to commercial, to talk it through off camera. One of them begged her to take a break so they could discuss it. Joy shook her head. There was nothing to talk about, she said. She had made her decision. She walked across the stage, handed her microphone to a stunned producer standing just off camera, and kept going. The camera cut back to Cranston, who was still standing at the table, looking like someone who had just witnessed a slow-motion disaster. The remaining hosts were visibly shaken, unsure whether to cut to commercial or try to salvage what remained of the show. Cranston slowly sat back down, rubbing a hand through his hair. In a quiet voice, almost to himself, he said he never wanted that to happen. One of the hosts leaned toward him and said softly that they knew. But the damage was already done. The chair where Joy had been sitting moments earlier was empty, and somewhere beyond the reach of the cameras, a legend of daytime television was walking out the door, leaving behind a stunned audience and a conversation that had spiraled completely out of control. So, what do you think? Was Joy right to walk away, or did she overreact? Should Bryan Cranston have approached the conversation differently, or was he simply standing his ground? Let us know what you think in the comments, and make sure to subscribe. We'll be following this story closely, because this is one conversation that's far from over.